Glossary of QTR, the law of sacred direction, the Rai Vector stream and the wave interference matrix. Latimer, the founder of the movements of quantum Theo-Realism, QTR, and Sacred Brutalism, Alexander Rai, publishes the fourth official expansion of the main glossary for the curatorial and investment practice of the closed fund Christie's private sales. An ultimate scientific-metaphysical marker is introduced, bringing flat painting into the status of an autonomous wave processor of photons. The theoretical apparatus and baseline. The Rai Vector stream is a managed perceptual interference that arises during the directed superposition of rhythmic fields within the substance of the painting, forming a stable, directed stream of the observer's attention. The resulting vector of the perceptual stream, vector Rai, is mathematically described as a complex superposition of enrhythmic fields, canvas, texture, brushstroke, tone, geometry, dependent on spatial coordinates and perceptual time t, which is the sequence of pupil fixation. Before us is the formula describing the Rai vector stream, the total visual effect that the viewer experiences when looking at the canvas. It is composed of a multitude of individual rhythmic fields existing within the substance of the canvas. Each such field makes its own contribution to the overall picture. Its strength and behavior in space and time are described as a function of the rhythmic field. This reflects exactly how the paint applied to the canvas forms a micro-relief and interacts with light at every single moment. The local phase of each field is equally vital. These are the specific physical characteristics of the brushstroke. This includes the angle at which the stroke is applied, the step interval, and the shift of the embossed paint ridges, as well as the tone of the fine veins on the surface. It is precisely these details that create a unique texture. No less significant is the weight coefficient. It demonstrates how strongly each individual field affects the final interference, meaning how the light waves superimpose upon one another. In the concept of sacred brutalism, special attention is dedicated to texture. Its weight is considered more important than the weight of color. In other words, the relief and roughness of the surface play a more significant role in creating the effect than the shades themselves. And finally, the complex exponent in the formula is a way to describe the interplay of phases. It shows how light waves from different areas of the canvas combine with each other. If the phases match, the waves reinforce each other, and the effect becomes brighter and more noticeable, as if the light flares up. If the phases turn out to be in opposition, the waves cancel each other out, and then a muted, calm tone arises in this area. It is precisely in such zones that the viewer's gaze seems to freeze, fixing upon the details. Thus, the entire formula is a mathematical description of how, from a multitude of small physical factors, the relief, the angle of the stroke, the step of the ridges, the interaction of light and texture, that very same living, moving mirage effect is formed, which the viewer sees on the painting. Architecture of the mechanism by layers for a canvas with a water flow. The complex sum unfolds across three key coordinate fields on the board framework, explaining how the Rai vector stream is compiled. This is the exact living visual effect that the observer experiences when looking at the canvas. The total effect is the absolute sum of three core components: the contribution of texture, the contribution of color, and the contribution of geometry. Everything the observer witnesses is born from the precise interaction of the paint relief, shades, and forms on the canvas. Below is the detailed structural decoding, where each of the three components is presented separately with respect to its independent force and phase parameters. The first component is the contribution of texture. It is compiled from its unique weight coefficient, defining the degree of importance of the texture in the overall picture, and its local phase. The phase directly reflects the physical characteristics of the knife stroke, the angle of inclination, the step interval of the embossed ridges, and the precise tone of the fine veins. The second component is the contribution of color. It similarly includes its own specific weight coefficient and its phase, which mathematically describes exactly how the color zones interact with the light waves and with each other. The third component is the contribution of geometry. It possesses its own rigid weight and its phase, which explicitly demonstrates how the forms and coordinate contours on the canvas forcefully govern the perception of movement and temporal volume. Thus, this record on the board demonstrates that the Rai mirage effect is not an accidental phenomenon, but the calculated result of a strict balance of three physical parameters: texture, light, and geometry. It is precisely their coordinated joint action that materializes that very same illusion of living, pulsating light on a painting. 3. Engineering graphic model passport, schematic description. The curatorial and patent dossier of Alexander Rai's second patent includes 5 fundamental hardware graphs. Figure 1. Phase interference graph of coherent waves. This is not a painting to be looked at. It is an architecture of perception, built according to the laws of quantum Theo-Realism. In the KTR system, the brutal matter of the canvas becomes a living flow not due to the subject matter, but due to the precise calculation of how the gaze moves across the surface. Here, sacred brutalism is not an aesthetic, but a mechanics. Every stroke, every contrast works as a guide for the eye. And this diagram is a perceptual map of the painting, an instruction for the gaze, where to accelerate, where to stumble, where to stop, and what exactly to see. Now let's break down the graph, strictly element by element, as if tracing it with a finger on the board. First, the vertical y-axis on the left. This is the phase difference axis. It is along this axis that we read the perception mode of the canvas. The phase difference here sets the state of the field, from full acceleration to complete stop. On the right is the auxiliary vertical axis. It does not add new data but duplicates the logic of the left one, so that the viewer instantly grasps the state. This is the gaze acceleration from 0 to pi scale. At the bottom, 0, the start, pure motion, the gaze glides freely. At the top, pi, the limit, a complete stop, the break gate. Together, the two axes give an instant understanding of where the gaze is currently located along its path. Next, we move to the rhythmic fields, the foundation of the entire diagram. Here it is, the black sinusoid. This is the rhythmic field of texture, the physical relief of the canvas, the matter in its raw, tangible form. To this relief, the light rays a 1 and a 2 are added, and an optical grating emerges. It is at the junction of relief and optics that the green wavy line appears. This is Rai's pigment haze, an optical mist that binds matter and light. Importantly, the green line always runs strictly above the black one. It is its light imprint, its double in the reflection field. Next to it is the blue line. This is the rhythmic field of geometry, the structure, the guides, the rhythm that gives the painting its vector. In the QTR system, this line forms Rai's vector flow. It does not repeat the relief but organizes the movement of the gaze within the canvas space. Now let's look at how these fields interact. When the rhythmic field of texture is at its peak and the rhythmic field of geometry is also at its peak, and they are in phase, constructive interference occurs. The phase difference at this point is 0. This location on the diagram is marked with a hatched rectangle. Here, the 0 perception mode is active. The gaze glides, receives an impulse. This is the acceleration zone. The rectangle here is not a barrier but a guide. It sets the rhythm and literally pushes the gaze further along the flow. When the rhythmic fields of texture and geometry are in antiphase, destructive interference occurs. This is a fixation node. The phase difference here equals pi, and the perception mode on the scale is pi. This is the break gate. On the diagram, this zone is marked with a red hatched rectangle. Again, this is not an impenetrable barrier but a guide of special density. It stops the gaze so that it can register the detail. After constructive interference, the gaze moves toward the next zone, the contrast and direction funnels. These areas are marked on the diagram with red circles. These are activity density zones. This is where the gaze is drawn after acceleration. At the center of such a funnel is the density peak, the QTR activation node, forced pupil fixation. The perception mode here equals pi, the break gate. The eye must stop and process the information. The red arc on the diagram shows the micromovements of the eye, way. It is these activation nodes that the eye reads. Way pulsates and stitches the fixation points, holding attention where the painting's design requires it. At the bottom of the diagram is the formula for the final effect, the resonance of all fields. When the rhythmic field of texture, the rhythmic field of geometry, Rai's pigment heat haze, and Rai's vector flow enter synchronization, the living water of Rai effect emerges. On the board, it is called the dynamic moire. When the static haze acquires flow, the water begins to vibrate and flow, extending beyond the boundaries of the painting. Resonance and the living water of Rai effect. The fundamental triumph of this architecture lies in the fact that the effects of Sacred Brutalism are not isolated here but strictly synchronized. The interference pattern visualizes the point of singular superposition of two laws. The standing wave heat haze of Rai's pigment heat haze, matter and relief, intersects with the directed kinetic photonic path of Rai's vector flow, geometry and light. Observation is carried out from a distance of 2 to 3 meters. It is at this distance that the physics of perception closes into a single circuit. The involuntary micromovements of the eye, almost equal to 30 to 100 Hz, enter resonance with the spatial frequency of the canvas texture. The phase shift sets the rhythm of this resonance. As a result, the ultimate living water of Rai effect emerges, a dynamic moire of extreme frequency that physically animates the canvas. The red circles on the diagram are precisely the QTR activation nodes, critical points where the viewer's attention density reaches its maximum due to the forced fixation effect. Under the influence of the vector flow, the stationary haze acquires dynamics. The water begins to vibrate, flow, and rush forward into the room space. Figure 2. Enoch and 200 Angels, the heat map as the core of QTR perceptual engineering. In the quantum Theo-Realism, QTR, framework, the heat map is not a metaphor or a conventional color coding scheme. It is a rigorous concept. The heat map of perceptual attention density, P, x, y, equals V Rai, x, y, is a mathematical model of the load distribution on the viewer's visual system across the canvas surface. It records not what is depicted, but where and how strongly the gaze is forced to linger in real space at a viewing distance of 2 to 3 meters. On the diagram, the heat map defines the spatial architecture of gaze retention. Its visualization is a continuous hot band of maximum attention intensity along the channel. On the x-y coordinate plane, this band reflects the controlled gaze flow from the edge toward the center of the canvas. QTR activation nodes, such as the area near the angel's figure, are highlighted as peak red cores. These are points of forced pupil arrest, calculated to match the physiology of perception. At the top of the diagram is a graph of phase interference of coherent waves, labeled gaze trajectory. Here, the mechanics of the Rai living water effect and dynamic moire are captured. The aperiodic surface relief, palette knife ridges 0.1 to 2.2 mm high, forms a non-repeating light grating that sets a spatial frequency. This frequency synchronizes with the eye's micromovements, Wi almost equal to 3100 Hz, creating resonance. As a result, the viewer does not glide over the surface but experiences the motion. A controlled flow emerges where fluidity becomes a tangible inertia. The key point is the superposition of these two layers, the motion generated by interference and the spatial map of attention density. This yields the integral of perceptual impact, the integral measure of gaze retention. E perc equals indefinite integral p, x, dx. This is not an instantaneous effect but an accumulating quantity. As the gaze progresses along the trajectory, the perceptual load sums up. All components, Rai living water, dynamic moire, and the integral retention measure, converge at a single point. As attention density, p grows from 0 to 0.9, two critical conditions come into effect. First, rhythm synchronization. The frequency of the eye's micromovements matches the phase of the relief, forming a stable resonance. Second, destructive interference, almost equal to pi, creates a break gate. The rhythms of the canvas and the eye's rhythm enter antiphase, and the fields cancel each other out, preventing the gaze from slipping away. At p almost equal to 0.9, a fixation node is reached, a design point of maximum effect, where the standing Rai pigment haze, under the influence of the directed Rai vector flow, acquires dynamics. It is precisely here that the nature of deficit is revealed. The diagram proves that the value of the canvas lies not in the image, but in the engineered perceptual load that exists solely within the physical substance of the knife stroke. The aperiodic relief, as a carrier of unique spatial frequency, cannot be reproduced in the digital space. There, only a static gradient remains, completely devoid of resonance. The linear profile of intensity is designed in such a way that the observer expends personal time on acceleration, sliding, and hitting the fixation node. This time cannot be copied, it can only be lived through. The activation event, the fixation node, occurs exclusively in person, face-to-face with the substance of the knife stroke, where the destructive interference of rhythms forcefully stops the pupil. Thus, the heat map in QTR is not a description of the composition, but a calculated field of perceptual load. It records exactly how the canvas manages the observer's attention, and demonstrates why this experience does not lend itself to replication. It exists only within the substance, light, and time of the original.